doing unstructured data with Cushman and Wakefield. So as we continue to talk about the data, the value that can be derived out of that data, we sit with the structured and unstructured side of it. So joining us and walking us through that case study, we have Chris Wells, the VP of Solutions at Indico Data, and we have Thomas Mendel, the Product Manager for Intelligent Data Capture at Cushman and Wakefield. Thomas, Chris, welcome to CIO Select.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Thank you.
Chris, I see you. Thomas.
Can you see me now?
Yeah, I gotcha. Perfect. So I'm going to put myself on mute and I'm going to let you guys take it off.
Great. Thank you, Marie. Thomas, how are you today?
Good. How are you doing, Chris?
I'm good, thank you. It's good to see you again, as always. And thanks for taking the time to sit down.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me.
So, let's start with the usual question. What does Cushman do and what does your role there look like?
Yeah, so we are a global commercial real estate services company. So we offer services to both occupiers as well as tenants of spaces ranging from property and facilities management all the way up through valuation and advisory. And so in our organization, I sit on our Transformation Center of Excellence, and my role specifically is our product owner for the Indico platform that we utilize, as well as for intelligent data capture in general. So making sure that we're thinking about how we use intelligent automation and natural language capture the right way throughout our organization and identify the correct use cases in the most efficient way that we can go about transforming those for our business lines.
That's great. I work with centers of excellence of all shapes and sizes across different industries. I'd love to hear a little bit about how Cushman's automation COE, I should say transformation COE, even grander title, how that got started and sort of how it's constructed. And I'd even love to know, like, how do you maintain business relationships and things like that?
Yeah, of course. So we had actually formed the transformation COE at Cushman before I had even come on board to the company. So it's been a couple of years in the making for us. And really the task when this team had first started is there's a need in the organization to create operational efficiencies, both through process transformation as well as through applying what at the time was our automation stack of just RPA. So that really was how it all got started. And then over time, it's really been evolving to how do we go beyond just looking at RPA and bring in tools like intelligent process automation with Indico to make sure that we can get things automated from an end-to-end standpoint and continue to expand the types of use cases that our team can support over time, as well as how do we continue to expand the business lines internally that we're able to help service and support through our intelligent automation offerings, not just in the Americas, but also for our global Cushman team as well.
Right on. That's exciting. One of the things that varies most as I talk to COEs across industries is the relationship with the business. So does the business come to you with a problem fully formed? Is it more of a consultative partnership? How does that work at Cushman?
For us, it's really been a consultative partnership with our business units. So we'll see both of those cases that you had mentioned, Chris, and that sometimes the business lines will have specific use cases that they know are pain points for them, or that they see opportunities with, given things that we've done in the past that they'll raise to us, and then we'll collaborate with them on how best to approach. And then other times it's us going to the business saying, let's take a look through what other work you all have and what other processes you all are spending a lot of time with to see if there is an opportunity for our team to help out there. So that's the combination of both of those approaches we found to be really helpful, since over time, as the business gets more familiar with what we do, they tend to get better at identifying those use cases on their own from experience. And then as we continue to grow our capabilities, I think that's where that continuing collaborative partnership works out really well, is that we continue to expand the capabilities that we have. So there may be new things that we now can do that the last time we had worked with the team wasn't an option for us. So something that we may have said, this wasn't feasible for us 6 months ago, we now can actually bring in scope due to changes with our technology stack.
Yeah, that's great. That's a really healthy approach. And you make a great point. There is definitely a if you build it, they will come effect that happens with these things. How do you and your team, being that Cushman's a very large multinational organization, how do you spread the good news of automation and transformation around the org?
Yeah, for us, it's really building those key relationships with our business stakeholders at the right levels in the organization to know who are the people that have visibility into the work that their teams are doing within a service line and can help to connect us to people that may not be as aware of what we've been doing. And then in that case, that's where we'll do a lot of product demos and roadshows to show those stakeholders, here's something similar that we've done maybe for a different service line, but the underlying process is nearly identical to what they're doing, and be able to show them that offering that we already have in place to start get the ball rolling of, is there an opportunity to leverage a similar solution within this business line, or is there maybe a related but different process that they have that's a little bit unique that we can look at applying it to. So I think that's where it's been really fun and interesting for us as we've grown over the years, is to see how our different business lines have unique challenges and opportunities, but also how sometimes there is a good amount of overlap where we're able to take some things we've done in one area and look to refactor that and apply it in another area of the business to drive value.
Excellent. You talked a little bit about the journey you've been on the last year or so. One of the things that I've seen trending out there, LinkedIn and other places, is this notion of RPA fatigue. It sounds like Cushman hasn't fallen prey to that RPA fatigue. Talk to me about how you've accomplished that.
Yeah, I think for us, it's really been strategically, we realized very early on in our transformation journey that RPA alone wasn't going to allow us to enable the types of use cases and capabilities that we needed to deliver to our business leads. So that's why very early on in our journey, we had brought on Indico to expand that capability. And that's something that our team has continued to look at, as in addition to what we're doing with RPA and what we've been doing with Indico to date, what other products are there out there, as well as how do those two platforms themselves continue to change and evolve through new releases in the product roadmap, and continuing to add that to our stack of capabilities, as well as how we think about solutioning use cases going forward. So I think because that approach on our end has continued to evolve over time, and we're constantly looking for what are those new enablers out there, either with existing platforms or with a new platform that makes sense for us to bring on to continue to expand the scope and meet the needs that teams have.
Yeah, at Indico, we talk a lot about automation fabric and really weaving together the right tools for the right purposes. And I think Cushman is, ahead of the game in terms of building out that quilt of automation services. I want to give you a little chance to show off here. Talk about all the good things you've been doing the last year. Like, what are the ways that you've really scaled automation? What are the big victories that you've seen?
Yeah, I think for us, it's really been moving from what I call simpler, more rules-based processes to the more complex, higher touch and higher value use cases. So even within document processing, really for us, our journey had started on the simpler side with invoices and bank statements. So more of those more structured documents, and really growing over time to how do we change that mindset and the fabric of our team, where really before we qualified use cases of are they highly repetitive, and is it consistently rules-based, to now looking at things that aren't as repetitive or more variable, less rules-based, and more unstructured documents like leases and contracts, and looking to incorporate automation into processes that really require a lot more human judgment and decision making, where we can't program in those clear if then type of rules. That's really where we've seen the biggest growth in our team this past year. And I think on top of that, it's also looking at how we use all of this valuable data that we're getting from automating processes, and going from thinking about automation just to how do we achieve processing of transactions as as quickly or efficiently as possible, to then thinking through what are the insights and reporting that we can now get on a process that we didn't have before when we were doing it manually, and how do we use those insights and data on a process that are now available to us to change how we think about that type of work and make better decisions off of it.
Yeah, I want to hear a little bit about the things that have been hard in that journey, but you piqued my interest with, really going beyond automation to analysis. And what do you see as the frontier there? Like, what are the insights that are showing themselves to be most valuable right now?
I think a lot of it in the early stages is just getting better visibility onto what's actually going on with the process. So
Yeah.
I'll take the example of invoices. Ideal state, obviously, all the invoices go through first time without any issues. But as we all know, there's challenges that come up where either an invoice needs to go through another layer of review, or it doesn't have all the prerequisite details to be processed at first touch. And what we see through automation is, by putting that structure in place around a process, is you start being able to get insights on what does your true straight through percentage look like. When exceptions do come up, you can start categorizing those into buckets that make sense to the organization, to really determine, here's the percentage of exceptions, and within that bucket, here's how it originated in terms of, is it something that we need to work with a vendor on? Is it a potential relook at how we're doing the process internally? Those types of insights are incredibly valuable in the process. And I think it's always interesting for us seeing, when we put that in place, we always have an idea of what we expect before we go live with the project. And then after we're live, it's interesting to see how some of those assumptions that we had either get validated or change completely because of that, or what insights we weren't even expecting to find about a process that starts coming out when the data comes through about the process.
Interesting. Okay. That's a thread I could probably pull for another hour or two. But I want to circle back to the year, the year plus that you've been working on this. Talked about some of the victories and some of the things that have been opened up to you by getting structure out of your unstructured data. What have some of the struggles been, and how have you sort of moved past them, or if you're stuck somewhere, would love to hear about that.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges that we've seen looking to apply automation in the past year is just the difference in expectations out there that people have. So I feel like automation in RPA has become really hot, in that there's a lot of articles and posts about it out there, either online and on LinkedIn, that teams will see. And then I feel like from that, a lot of people have the perception that automation's really, I'm going to hand you over something that I do today manually, and it's going to be completely automated, no human touch going forward from there. And really what we're finding is that's not the case, where automation is really helping teams. It's less about replacing the human element of the process, and more about augmenting and accelerating that processing time. So then we can strategically look at how people are doing the process today, and either say, do we now have the ability to support more work than we did before with those teams, or is there other functions such as that reporting and insights piece that we would have loved to be able to tag people to before, that we just didn't have the bandwidth because we needed to get items processed and cleared through the queue. So I think just that that perception about what automation is, and really it's not taking over something completely, and it's really more about augmenting the human element of the process. So then they're focusing their time on the true value add steps in the process where we need someone to do the analysis, do the evaluation, do that manual exception handling process. And that's some of the expectations that we've been working with our teams to level set while we've been on this journey.
Yeah, I think the thing that gets the attention in the headlines is like level 5 autonomy, self-driving cars, humans don't have to get involved at all. And it's interesting, like the way that manifests itself across different industries, right? You're pointing to the fact that, maybe it's level 3 or level 4 autonomy that's possible, and that's okay. What are your strategies or approaches to changing that mindset? Is it really sort of proof by example, or are there other tactics that you've seen be successful?
A lot of it is through conversations with the team. So a lot of what we try to do around that is to set expectations with our stakeholders early on to show what it is that we're going to be delivering. And as part of that, it's the expectation that we're not going to see everything go through. And that doesn't mean that our project isn't successful, right? It's still, we're creating value for the items that we do process through. And it's how do we ensure that we have the right monitoring and reporting process in place to show that over time. So having those conversations early on in a project before we even get on to development of how are we going to measure success, what does success look like for the team, and getting agreement and buy-in on that early on has been really helpful for us, as well as like setting that expectation for our processes that use Indico. A lot of times it's aligning on the metrics that matter. So oftentimes we'll want to see what accuracy of the tool looks like and how all of the different attributes that we're pulling out of documents are performing. But really, when we look at the impact of a process, what we focus on is how long is it taking someone to process a document through a review queue if it's being used for Indico, versus how long did it take someone to process that document manually before. Because really that's the value that we're driving, is how much time did we accelerate from what they were doing today versus what we can do with the platform. And if we have a high level of accuracy, but it's taking someone forever to do that review process, then I'd say that that isn't as efficient as a project for us, is something that maybe is less accurate, but people are able to process through that review queue very quickly. So it's really aligning on what makes sense for us to track as success for a project, and then how do we ensure we have the right tools and reporting on our end to then be able to share that out with the team as we're in production to align on where we thought we would be versus where we are after something's in production.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And you're pointing to, some obvious, very tangible benefits, right? The reduction in time on task. You talked about the analytics that are made possible now that you sort of have put these things into production. You can see how they're working. I would almost coin a phrase like intelligent process mining, right? That becomes possible.
Right.
What have you seen as some of the knock-on, maybe less tangible benefits of employing this sort of like human-centric machine learning or AI?
I think some of the less tangible benefits is through that time that we open up and seeing how much more efficiently we can process documents. It's what other data can we go after that we just didn't before, because it either wasn't as priority or we would have liked to, but we didn't have time to do it because the team didn't have enough resources, that it wasn't worth pulling out these other two fields. So it's really thinking through, are there pieces of data that in an ideal world we would have extracted that we just haven't been processing so far? And then how do we use the data that we already have today, not just from a transactional basis, but how do we do trend analysis and reporting off of that to glean insights, whether that's we just want to look at simple things of how much volume has changed over time, or is it we want to look at very specific clause language in a document and see if there's trends or common themes in it. I think those are some of the less tangible and harder to quantify benefits that the technology really allows us to start exploring.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, you're again pointing beyond automation to analytics. That's exciting. I think you're at the forefront of doing these things. On a more practical note, I don't know a lot of human beings that love having their day jobs changed on them. And as you introduce new tools and new processes, in some cases, I think you're dramatically changing the work that they do. How have you seen the reception to these new processes and the adoption take place?
Yeah, I think like you'd expect with any change management effort, there's kind of the two groups of people that we naturally see. Some people out of the gate love it and are really excited to use it because they practically see that benefit of how it's making something that they were doing before easier. And then on the other end, for maybe users that aren't as familiar with the types of platforms that we're using, or it's their first time going through one of these projects, there is that steeper learning curve. So really what we've done is embed change management into our delivery cycle to make sure that, one, we're making sure that users are aware of what's going in, how it's going to change things from how they're doing today, but also enable them through training and upskilling. So making sure, as we're expecting them to do something different from how they are today, that we're providing the tools and guidance that they need to understand it, but also working with them through that transition to make sure that we're available to answer questions and realize that some people are going to adopt the tool very quickly and it'll click with them. And some users, we may need to devote more time to training and help them as that transition continues on, or as they start seeing more complex examples when new documents come through. So it's really that constant training life cycle to make sure that the resources that we're expecting to change how they've been doing things from how they might have been doing it for a couple months all the way to a couple of years in some cases, that we're giving them the right training and support to enable that change.
Yeah, I think that's a great insight. Like, if humans are going to be a part of the process on a go forward, then you can't just pay lip service to that, right? Like, you have to get them comfortable. You have to get them comfortable in being part of it. For the folks on the call who are at the beginning of either their automation journey or their unstructured journey, or they're sort of thinking about leaping off of that cliff, what advice would you give, Thomas, in terms of, what are the hallmarks of a good first use case or first workflow that you want to inject some intelligence into?
Yeah, I think for looking at a first use case, my advice would be to look for something that is strategic and adds value to the organization, but also that you're not going after the most challenging or most complex project first. So being able to take something that the technology is going to work for, can reasonably be delivered, and then building upon that over time. So I think that momentum factor is really important to be able to show that initial success and then scale it, as well as not trying to solve for the world. I think is something that our team has learned and grown over time, since a lot of processes, when you dive into the specifics and the nuances of them, each process itself can be very complex. But a lot of times there's ways to simplify it, of thinking through, what is the critical path, or is there a portion of volume that if we just go after that, we're going to get 80% of the entire volume of this process, and then that 20% where the gray area comes in, we can always look at adding on to it later. And I think the other piece of this that has been really interesting, is our team has learned, is it's really balancing that fine line, I'd say, Chris, between knowing when you can apply the technology to a use case and when you should apply the technology to a use case. And what I mean by that is, it's easy to come in and look at a process at first glance and say, like, oh, we can plug in RPA here, we can plug in Indico here. But sometimes we need to take that step back to say, do we even need to do that? Or do we need to think about restructuring or changing this process and then realize we actually have structured data upstream somewhere that we converted to unstructured data, and it doesn't really make sense for us to try to convert that back into a structured form if we can just go at the root source of that data that we had initially. So I think that's really the challenge, is being able to think critically through the process and see, while we can often apply a lot of these great automation tools to it, does that even make sense in the first place? Or do we need to think about redesigning the process first and then seeing if those automation platforms still make sense at that point?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. In a similar vein, you talked a little bit about the need for multiple technologies. There's not one end-all be-all platform for all of transformation and automation. For those folks who are looking at sort of spinning up a center of excellence to own these things, what are the critical roles that they should be thinking of getting in place first?
Yeah, I think it's really being able to bring that end-to-end solution mindsets and making sure that there's people on a team that are familiar enough with the different products that they're looking to bring on board to help support from a technical as well as solution design standpoint, how we should be applying those, as well as either in addition to those folks or in conjunction with that skill set, people that can really think critically about the process and understand the right questions to ask to make sure that how that process is structured and designed makes sense. And then like who from the organization is going to be not only the people that can develop and build out the technology from a technical standpoint, but also what does that support process look like? I feel like sometimes when we get started with these types of projects, it's how do we hit the ground running and get as much stuff through the builds life cycle as we can. And then as you start to have more and more things live, what you start seeing is that support lifecycle management becomes really important, or almost a pain point if you haven't thought about it early enough. So I'd say like being able to stay focused on that from the beginning, as well as we've had a great relationship with our compliance team internally. So understanding as we go and touch processes that may have data requirements or subject to internal controls, just how does automation potentially change or not change any of that, to make sure as we're retooling things internally that we're thinking about it both from a saving standpoint and operational efficiency, as well as any potential risk or compliance impacts that we can either make sure that we're in compliance to, or even help to improve existing compliance with some of that reporting that, back to earlier, that we can provide on the process that maybe they hadn't before. I think that's an ancillary benefit that oftentimes can get overlooked, but it's really valuable through automation if we're able to make that auditor compliance journey easier later on.
Yeah, I think a lot of times, obviously, the focus in the automation space is on increasing capacity for the top line or decreasing the bottom line, but figuring out what risks you're exposed to and mitigating those is also in play, for a mature organization. We're coming up on just a couple minutes left here, so I have one last question. But first, I wanted to ask you, what did I forget to ask? What did you want to share that I didn't touch on?
I think you covered most of it on my end, Chris. So
okay, all right. So I'll ask my capstone question. In 5 years, when we're doing this webinar again, probably in the metaverse somewhere, what will we be talking about as the biggest things that happened in the previous 5 years? Like, what's the forefront of all of this?
I think a lot of it's going to be changing from the transactional processing to analytics, and probably over time getting in the later span of that 5 years, getting into the predictive analytics space. So like, how do we start thinking about all of this historical data that's coming through, and not only reporting on what's happened to date, but also how does that change how we start thinking about forecasting and modeling projections going forward? I can definitely see that playing a big role as we start getting access to more of this data that wasn't really exposed or viable to get access to before. Now that we're capturing more and more unstructured data, I think that reporting life cycle is going to really start taking off.
Awesome. And thank you for not saying all Word documents would be NFTs on your internal blockchain. I appreciate avoiding that answer. Marie, that's about all I had, and I see we're at time. Thomas, thank you so much. This was really insightful. A lot of good stuff there.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Thomas, for joining us today.
Of course, anytime.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Marie.